Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. You are looking at the weekly chart provided by netdania.com. You can click on the link below. This is the big picture view of silver. This is the weekly chart with just a few lines drawn in here. We've got the primary trend line, which you can see we are attempting to correct back to. We have the primary support line, which is the last major high, which was the Bear Stearns top. And then we have the weekly MACD low point, which was reached at the 2008 bottom. So these are the ones we're keeping an eye on. The recent article by Clive Mond, he's come out extremely bearish. He expects a crash, but as some viewers have pointed out in the comment section, Clive seems to jump back and forth quite a bit. He may be right on this one, but he might just reverse himself. So we're looking for this MACD to reverse. If we do get a correction down to the primary trend line, we probably will make new lows on the MACD. If we get a correction down to the primary support line, there's no question we will make new lows, and that will be the most oversold silver has been since 1995. We already are approaching that point. Once we cross this line, we will be the most oversold we've been since 1995. So that will be the largest buying opportunity in silver in 17 years. Now, I have very serious doubts as to whether you're going to be able to get silver anywhere near that price. If you recall, I've frequently gone over my purchases that I made here, and when I do my blog roll at the end here, I'll mention the article, but the interview that Victory Independence did with David Morgan. And David Morgan pointed out that at that bottom here, it was virtually impossible to get silver for that price. So it was going for about a 40% premium. So I fully expect that if we do reach these prices, you'll see something like that, a 40 or 50% premium. So even if we're trading at 22, it may still be $30 an ounce. That's very possible. There's a point, people have asked me before, when do you buy? Again, I've pointed out I don't give investment advice, but I just tell you what I do. And what I've done in the past is on those occasions where silver is plunging quite rapidly on high volume, usually at nighttime, where you have Gainesville and APMEX and some of the others that are trailing the price of silver. And as I pointed out with this MF Global situation, they may not be able to do that in the future because their hedge book isn't in existence, or they might not be able to use their hedge book. For instance, I know that Eric and Joe of Patriot Radio and All American Gold, I believe they've announced that they're not going to sell gold at this low price. So it's quite possible that that won't happen in the future. But normally you want to look for a circumstance where the price is dropping so rapidly that either through reluctance to sell at such low prices, but my guess is, honestly, in their defense for both APMEX and Gainesville, I managed to make purchases here, here, and here. I haven't made any purchases recently on this drop we're on. So, but I did notice that the lag on the site was, both sites was tremendous. It was very difficult to get an order in, and that was probably just because so many people were rushing in to buy. And that's another thing that David Morgan pointed out in today's interview. So this is the big picture. This is what we're keeping our eye on, and we'll see how this works itself out. Now, I wanted to take you over to the main story of the night. I'm going to take you to a spreadsheet that I have created here, and if you look at the top, you can see, hopefully this is close enough resolution for you, that I've named this spreadsheet Silver Producers Arranged Reduction Coalition, or S.P.A.R.C. And I've tried to come up with something similar to OPEC And the reason why is I was inspired by Eric Sprott, who recently spoke about how he believes that the silver producers, and I absolutely agree, are pretty much getting ripped off because they're producing silver at a fairly high cost, and then they're selling it and keeping cash. Well, they're not getting any interest on their cash. So Eric's suggestion is that the silver producers should keep their savings or their cash in silver, and so that he's trying to encourage that. I wanted to add to that and make the suggestion that perhaps the silver producing countries should join together in some type of coalition similar to that of OPEC to keep their countries from being robbed of this vital natural resource at such low prices. So by way of comparison, I wanted to start out with a number of figures on the oil business. Now, these were a little hard to pull out of Google. I searched for yearly world oil consumption. You can see that up in the search bar. I searched for yearly world oil production. You got all these barrels per day and all this crazy stuff. Finally, I found a article here, a peak oil sort of article, but at least I got a figure that was cited. This is from 2008, but I would estimate that it's probably increased a bit with the Eastern, and then a decrease in the West with the recession. We're probably still near 31. At most, we're probably about 35. So let's just say we're at 35 billion barrels a day of production. That's roughly going to equal consumption. Now, 35 billion barrels, and we're just going to use the round number of 100. That's going to come to $3.5 trillion. So the world oil market is worth roughly $3.5 trillion. Now, that's a lot of money. So the first objection that's going to come up, and I've accounted for that in my spreadsheet, the first objection that's going to come up is they won't be able to afford to do this. And my response to that is, if they can't afford to do this, then how could OPEC afford to do this when OPEC has to produce so much more and is so reliant for its percentage of GDP? And I'll show you that in the chart breakdown. So I think that's a bogus argument. I don't think that holds any water. I think that it would be much easier for the silver producers to create a coalition to withhold the product until the price rises to where they're fairly compensated. Now, to address that, I wanted to look at really quickly a video that's making the rounds, and it is, well, first of all, let's look at the silver production, and this is a breakdown by country. This is actually from the Silver Institute. These are the silver producing nations in order by the amount of production that they create. So you've got Mexico on top, Peru, then China, then Australia. Now when we begin to pull the GDP figures, you're going to see a big difference in these countries, and that'll come up in a second here. But let's look at this video, and I can't play this because I'm worried about potential copyright infringements, and I don't want to infringe on Discovery Channel's copyright. If there are videos out there, probably are Discovery Channel videos, but this is a video that's been making the rounds about silver mining. It's from First Majestic, and what they do is they document the silver mining and silver production process, and they go through a large amount of processes that you have to go through, and there is a unbelievable amount. They start off with dynamiting the rock, the ore, and then they haul that out, and then they have a giant grinder that grinds into large pieces. They have a second grinder that grinds into smaller pieces, another grinder that grinds it in even smaller pieces. Then they treat it with chemicals, then they filter it, then they run it through. It's an amazing video. You need to watch it and see how many processes. Then a fascinating part of it is where they put the little cups of the ore that's all mixed together into the furnace and treat it with a chemical that burns off all the other metals, and you get just the silver, and it's the tiniest, it's like a silver dime that you get out of all this work. So it's hard for me to even fathom how they make a profit, and for all I know, they aren't making a profit. This might be one gigantic conspiracy. So this is what gave me the idea, and we want to go to our spreadsheet, and I'm going to explain this to you. What these columns are the countries taken from the Silver Institute's production figures, and these are the countries in order of how much they produce. The second column is the actual production that these countries do. This is in millions of ounces. So you can see you've got Mexico at the top, you've got Peru next, and China next. Now these are going to be skewed when we start to look at the GDP, but next we want to look at the value. Now if you remember, when we were looking at the value of the world oil production, we had $3.5 trillion. Now these are in millions of dollars, so you're looking at Mexico's silver production is roughly 3.7 billion, then Peru is 3.3, and it goes down from there. So all of these together is, I don't know, what do we have, 700 million ounces of silver produced in a year, and we're at $29. So you do the math. It's not a lot. It's at most $30 billion, and not even that. So you're talking $30 billion on the one hand for all of the yearly silver production in the world. That's what it's valued at. And you've got 3.5 trillion is what all of the oil. So we're talking 100-to-1 ratio. So that's the value column, and that tells you what that's worth. Now the next column is a GDP of these nations, and I went and pulled this, and the reason why this is important is because my proposal is that these countries, and obviously not all of them, for example China and the United States, who are probably the most involved in suppressing the price of silver, it's highly unlikely that they would be involved in some type of silver producers arranged reduction coalition. Nevertheless, China is no longer an exporter of silver, it's actually an importer of silver. So that's kind of a wash there. But these other countries, what we want to do is we want to look at how much silver they produce in a year, and then we want to look at their yearly GDP, and we want to get a figure that is a percentage of their GDP. In other words, their silver production, all the silver that they sell in a year, how large of a percentage is that of their yearly GDP? And that will tell us, that is a key figure, because that's going to tell us how much they can afford this. Now, if you look at the top ones in this column, the two key countries in this column that jump out at you are Peru and Bolivia. The reason why is because these two countries produce a lot of silver. You can see that Bolivia is 8th in the world in silver production, and Peru is 4th in the world in silver production, yet their GDPs are very low. So for Peru, 1.2% of their GDP is actually coming from silver production. Now you have to remember the video that we showed you, that it's highly unlikely that this is a very profitable business, and that's why I'm recommending that these countries form some type of coalition so they can withhold their production, because ultimately it will be in their interest, because as you know, silver is probably 1/100th, at least 1/10 to 1/100th of the price it should be trading at. So countries like Peru and countries like Bolivia would actually be much richer if they formed a coalition to restrict their silver export until the price goes to a fair value. But the point is that Peru, with 1.2% of its GDP being produced by silver exportation, and Bolivia, with 2.5% of its GDP, would be the most vulnerables of the cartel, because they're the most dependent upon their silver export. Now, One of the big keys here is Mexico. You can see that Mexico actually produces just above Peru, is the biggest producer, and this is by a lot. So Mexico is the biggest producer of silver in the world, but Mexico has a GDP of $1.5 trillion a year. Now that's still just 1/10 of what China and the United States have, but that means that the percentage of their GDP that their silver export and silver production amounts to in dollar values of the raw dollars of the silver. This is not the profit. This is all the ounces valued at today's price. It's only 0.25% of their GDP. In other words, if Mexico withheld all of their silver from the world's market and didn't export any of their silver, they would only decrease their GDP by 0.25%. And actually, I think the number is much lower than that. So our vulnerable countries are going to be Peru and Bolivia. These are going to be the two hard ones to bring into this cartel. The rest of them won't be difficult at all because it's such a tiny percentage of their GDP. So let's look and see how much could be withheld if they did this. Mexico could withhold the entire 128 million ounces without a problem. Peru, let's say they can withhold a quarter, so maybe 30 million ounces. So we're now at 150 million total, 160 million total. China isn't going to be interested because they're part of the suppression scheme. Australia, who has only 0.1% of their GDP, it's nothing to them. And actually, if you look at what the Perth Mint is doing, it's my opinion that they actually are already withholding production because they're tightening the production on those coins and exports so much. But if we added Australia to this group, we're now talking about roughly 210 million ounces or so. Now Chile doesn't seem to be in too bad a shape, so we could add them. That's 250, and we'll skip Bolivia and just let them out of the cartel. So if we add all the rest together, the ones that might want to participate, you have ones like Kazakhstan, and you have Argentina. Russia may decide. Poland is actually a fairly large producer of silver. Canada, it's just a tiny percentage of their GDP. So we could probably get 400 million ounces of silver to be withheld from the world market to correct the price problem until it's corrected. And then there could be various actions depending on how the price reacts. 400 million ounces out of a market of 700 million ounces would be absolutely devastating. These nations, through this coalition, could literally bring world production of electronics to a standstill until they get what I would say would be roughly tenfold the silver price, which is somewhere around $300 an ounce, would be a fair price, at least to begin resuming production. So that's my suggestion. A coalition of silver producers, a range reduction coalition called S.P.A.R.C, or another name I thought of was S.P.E.C, based on OPEC, which would be silver producing exporting countries. It can be S.P.A.R.C or S.P.E.C, but basically what these countries would do is withhold their silver production until it's profitable for them to export it, and it's perfectly reasonable for them to do so. Now, I don't even want to talk about the implications of that because, as you know, they might be very dangerous for the parties involved, but that's my suggestion. Now, I wanted to do a quick blog roll because I did talk about the video that I covered on my blog today. I'm doing a blog roll because there are so many articles that I have to cover in my blog that I can't cover in my video. It's just too much. So at the top here we have the David Morgan interview with Victory Independence. Very interesting. It's 30 minutes. You need to listen to that. We've got Patriot Radio News Hour. Eric and Joe are always great. This is the video of Look What It Takes to Mine Silver. It's from First Majestic. I highly recommend that you watch this video. once you watch this video, you will realize that there is no way that it can be profitable to mine silver at the current prices, and there's got to be another explanation for it. This is the latest release from GEAB, that is the European Leap 2020 organization, and it's a very stark headline: Global Economic Crisis. The U.S. is an insolvent and ungovernable country. So they're very negative on the U.S. going forward. This is a video that's making the rounds. It's called The Shocking Truth About the EU Collapse. You definitely want to watch that. The latest article by Martin Weiss. Here's Naomi Prin's latest, and she digs deeply into the MF Global situation and totally exposes Corzine. And here's Bix Weir's latest. He connects the silver bar situation and MF Global. You really need to read that, and you really need to click on the link that goes here to Yahoo and how they connect silver to the MF Global situation. I've got a report on the California pensions, and obviously they are going bankrupt. Clive Mond's latest bearish call, and then there is my article I wrote on Sunday about Ron Paul. It's called The Good Doctor. I highly recommend you read this article. It's a little bit Christian in its content because it talks about the history of this country and some Bible verses, and then there's an excellent video by Styx that's about America and how she's lost her course. So I highly recommend you go through that blog roll. Again, we're looking at the long-term picture of silver, and I do believe that when we do make this bottom, whenever we do make this bottom, that's going to be the buying opportunity of at least the last 16 years, perhaps the century, and perhaps even of all time buying opportunity in silver. And we'll talk to you next time.